Hi, this is Harold Ree with the Paw Print Animal Rescue Podcast. Before we talk to the amazing Eric Zimmer, we have a few weeks left in our 2016 season. After that, Nancy and I will be taking a break and preparing for 2017. We'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review on our iTunes or Stitcher pages. Simply go to thisispawprint.com/iTunes or /Stitcher. Give us some feedback. Tell us who your favorite guest was. We look forward to hearing from you and closing out 2016 in style. Thanks, and on to the show.
There's just something about looking at them and seeing the way they are and the love that they give that reaches me in a place that other things don't on a heart level. And it's amazing to me because I went all those years of hating dogs. And now I'm like obsessed with them. Every dog I see, I'm just like, wow, it's like I found this new species.
This is Paw Print, an animal rescue community, episode 82. I'm Harold Ree.
And I'm Nancy Ree.
Today's guest is Eric Zimmer. Eric is host of an amazing podcast called The One You Feed, named a Best of 2014 podcast by iTunes. He and his best friend Chris produced the podcast, and the tagline is Creating a Life Worth Living. We learn about Eric, the podcast, his 3 dogs, Sadie, Ralph, and Beans, and he talks about how his dogs help him live a life worth living. If you want to learn more about Eric or the One You Feed podcast, go to our show notes at thisispawprint.com/82. That's the number 82.
Who am I? Well, that is a question that the philosophers and spiritual leaders have asked for a long time. Who am I? However, on a more prosaic level, I am the host of the One You Feed podcast. It's a podcast. It's an interview-style podcast where we explore what it means to create a life that's worth living. What's a way to live well? And so I interview lots of different people about that, authors and musicians and spiritual teachers and psychologists and anybody who really interests me who I think has something to say on that topic. So that's sort of what I do. I also do some individual coaching work with people over at that place. It's called The One You Feed. Besides that, I have, more pertinent to your show, I have 3 rescue dogs. Most of my career has been in the software business, mostly software startup companies, although I did found a solar energy company about 6 years ago.
Oh, great.
So I've done a lot of different things, but mostly it's been software, but my passion definitely these days is the show.
How much of your life does the show and any related ventures take up?
It's a mix. I mean, the show takes up a lot of time. We work really hard at it, and then I have the coaching, and then I still do a little bit of e-commerce consulting for some large Fortune 500 companies, here and there. So it's a mix.
Great, awesome. And where do you live now?
I live in Columbus, Ohio. I am talking to you, though, from Fishkill, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley, just north of New York City. I love to spend the weekend up here because it's beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I actually grew up in Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
I have a couple friends who went to Ohio State, but I've never been to Columbus, Ohio myself. So
it's really matured into a very great city, I think.
So if someone were going to look you up, the One You Feed podcast, what would be, 1 or 2 episodes that you might recommend they check out first?
Our most recent episode with Stephen Hayes is we're getting really good, getting a lot of good feedback on. Going back, it's been a while. There's one with James Clear, which I think is excellent.
James Clear, isn't he the blogger?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. He and I had a really good conversation. And I think those are a couple of the great ones. We had one with Dr. Gabor Maté recently that was good. But, everybody likes different ones for different reasons. It's hard for me to say, this is the, people resonate with different things. But I certainly think the Stephen Hayes one, the James Clear one, and the one with Dr. Gabor Maté recently have been, pretty well received, maybe just a hair bit above the others.
Do you want to maybe say the actual parable? Because it is interesting. You're one of the few people. I mean, I think most podcasters do have some type of sort of go-to questions, but you're the only podcaster that I've seen who has really like a go-to parable.
Yeah, and that's all I've got. That's it. After that question's done, I'm like, well, all right. Which is, I just, from there, it's all, I prepare a lot by reading, a lot of people's books. But anyway, the parable it's an old parable. Nobody really knows where it comes from. It's usually attributed to the Cherokee Indians, but there doesn't appear to be any real proof of that. So, doesn't matter though. It's a good parable. So there's a grandfather who's talking with his grandson. He says, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandson stops and he thinks about it for a second. He looks up at his grandfather and he says, "Grandfather, which one wins?" And the grandfather says, "The one you feed." So I read that parable and then I ask people, tell me what that parable means to you in your life and in the work that you do. That's kind of how we start the show.
Yeah.
And from there, we just, we go from there.
Any memorable answers that you received?
I don't know that any of them have, nothing like mind-blowing. What I did find, there's a couple things about it. One is it's a parable and it conveys a lot of information. What I have heard a lot of, though, which is maybe not what you would expect, is a lot of people saying about, hey, don't kill the bad wolf, right? Like that what we would think of is those bad parts of ourselves, trying to repress them or make them go away is not a good idea. How do you integrate that into your whole self? And so there's been a lot of conversation around that. And so I think that's the area that it goes that people might not expect as much. And I would say it goes that direction a lot. And that goes a lot with my sort of overall approach and philosophy to things.
You've mentioned that the podcast is we. Do you want to maybe talk about your partner in crime?
Yeah, my partner in crime is Chris, and he largely does the audio stuff. So he helps record, he helps edit. He's my best friend, and part of the reason I wanted to start the show was to spend more time with him, which has worked out brilliantly.
And he does the intro, correct?
He does. He does a lot of our voiceover work.
Right,
He's got a good radio voiceover.
Oh yeah,
voice.
Well, both of you have phenomenal voices.
Thank you.
So it's good. It's a good mix. It really is. So out of all the podcast themes, why choose this one, which is really a lot about spirituality, about good living, positive living? I don't know if that makes sense to you, but sort of why go that route? What is it in your own journey?
Well, I'm a recovering addict and alcoholic. So I was sort of forced to a type of spirituality in my younger life, kind of because I wasn't going to survive otherwise. And I've also wrestled with depression for years. So I think for me, how to live well and sanely in my own head without taking other substances to make my life easier has been a pretty fundamental part of what I have gone through. And so I started the show, like I said, partially to spend time with Chris, and also because for whatever reason, I just forget things over. And I think we're all this way. Life is so busy, we go on to what I call autopilot. Just go into autopilot and I take care of the things in life that need taken care of. And I completely forget that, at least for me, a lot of what's important about life and what makes life worth living is what's going on inside me, and paying attention to that and recognizing that. So the show was a way for myself to stay attuned to that. I thought, well, if I interview somebody every week, then I'll have to read their book every week, and it'll keep my head in a good spot. And it turns out that has worked pretty well.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? Podcasting, in a way, can become its own spiritual discipline, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, there's that old saying that, the teacher, teaches what they need to hear, or it's something like that, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I these conversations are really important to me personally, and they seem to have been very important to a lot of people. I mean, we've been listened to, 3.5 million times at this point. We've, iTunes named us to best of 2014 podcast. So we've had some degree of success, and I know that it resonates with a lot of people. But at its core, it's really for me to help myself stay in a good mental place.
Thanks for sharing that. When you think back upon your addiction, you think back upon dealing with depression, which of course in a lot of ways never ends. Any kind of, have you been able to ever pinpoint a root cause or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I mentioned earlier Dr. Gabor Maté as as a great interview, and he studies addiction a lot. And one of the things he says is not why the addiction, but why the pain. He believes that all addiction stems from some sort of underlying pain or disconnection. Now, I don't know exactly what that was for me. I could certainly tell you about my childhood and what my parents were like and this and that, and you might find some things there. The great thing about addiction for me is that I don't think you need to know what caused it in order to fix it. And so very little of my recovery has been on why. I think as I've gotten further from being sober and more into how do I live better, and I start looking at the way I interact with people in relationships and things like that, then I'm looking a little bit more at like, oh, what was my family like? Because we reenact those sort of things over and over. But I don't think we have to know the answers to why in order to get better, thankfully, because I don't think anybody would get better if that was the case, because you can't just say it's this thing. It's usually some combination of environment and genetics and your upbringing and temperament, and it's what you're exposed to when. It's very complex.
If someone was going to sign up for coaching with you, what's sort of your prime? What is your target audience? As my dogs bark, what is your target audience for your coaching?
My target audience for coaching is usually people who are stuck. People who have said to themselves over and over, I want to do X thing, and then they start it and they quit, and then they start it and they quit, whether that be exercise, whether that be building a meditation practice, whether that be finishing their dissertation from school or writing a novel or whatever it is. It's not the only thing I do, but the main focus of what I do is how do you change your behavior successfully?
Hopefully people listen to this and they really, really are intrigued at listening. So we're speaking with Eric Zimmer, one of the co-hosts who are really you're the prime voice of The One You Feed. Very, very good podcast to check out.
Thank you.
Now, of course, every once in a while, dogs will surreptitiously appear on your podcast. It happens to me all the time. How often does it happen to you?
We record the show at Chris's house, so there's only one dog at Chris's house. But it does happen. Charlie has certainly made his appearance. It tends to be more by rattling or shaking his collar, but he makes an appearance. If we were at my house, on the other hand, you would hear dogs probably pretty often. Okay, because I've got 3 of them.
Gotcha. Any animals, whether your current animals or previous animals, who've really inspired you?
Well, I think all 3 of my dogs are. They're certainly the light of my life. I don't think there's anything else in life that makes me happier, that gives me more just of that sort of pure sort of joy than the dogs do. We've got 3 of them. And the first one's an interesting story because it ties back to Chris. When I was growing up, I hated dogs. I was scared to death of them. I got bit by one as a kid. I was scared of them, which translated into animosity. Like, I deeply disliked dogs. For almost all of my life. And Chris found a dog at one point and adopted her. Her name was Birdie, and she was the most wonderful dog, just the sweetest, mild, everything about her I loved. It was the first time I think at that point I was kind of like, well, for a dog, she's pretty good. And I said to Chris one day, I was like, I might have a dog if it was like Birdie.
Huh.
And about 6 months later, or I don't remember how much later, I guess it's not important. One day he called me and said, well, can you come over? I said, okay. And I get there, and in the room is basically Birdie's twin. Like, I could not tell them apart at first.
Wow.
And so there was Birdie, and then there's my dog, Sadie. And Sadie, Chris had been out at some animal event, some, animal fair or whatever, and there was this dog that looked just like Birdie that had been rescued and needed a home. And so Chris brought her home, assuming that I would take her. And that if I didn't, then I suppose he thought he would take her. Mm-hmm. And that's how I got my first dog, Sadie.
Wow. Okay. So Sadie. And how many years ago was this?
13 or 14. Sadie's not young at this point.
That's okay.
And she remains just one of the most lovely animals out there. She is She is very old, though, so she doesn't see very well. She doesn't hear very well, but she's still very busy. She goes out and she walks the perimeter of the yard every day like it's her. I think it's her. She thinks it's her job to keep the place safe.
Tell us about your other two dogs.
So a few years later came Ralphie, and Ralphie was another one that was sort of hoisted upon me against my sort of like, I'm not sure I really want another, dog. But Ralph was found by a veterinarian about an hour and a half outside of Columbus, out sort of in the, in a more rural area. They had found Ralphie and his litter mates and no mom when they were days old. And so Ralph was bottle fed by them there, and we took him home when he was like 10 weeks.
Okay.
And he's a border collie / something that's not as intense or smart as a border collie. I can't quite tell what that other blend is. He looks exactly like some of the border collies you see. He's a beautiful dog, but he doesn't have that that intensity that a lot of border collies have. He's just very, very playful, very sweet. And then the last rescue. So we've had Ralph since 2007. So Ralph's about 8 now, coming up on 9. And Beansy is the baby, and she is a Boston Terrier. She was rescued from a puppy mill.
Okay.
And she's we got her when she was very, very much a puppy, and she's a Boston Terrier, and she's about 100 pounds of rotten crammed in that little 15-pound body.
Yeah.
She's a terror.
I'm guessing Beansy would be the one who would cause the most issues on a podcast, but you tell me.
Well, Ralph is, I refer to the 3 dogs as Loudmouth, that's Ralph, Stinky, that's Beansy, because Boston Terriers are gassy, and the Blind Wanderer, which is Sadie, because she can't really see, but she will wander off anywhere you give her a chance. If you let her go, she'll disappear for about 12 hours and then come home.
Okay. All right.
So Ralph would cause us the most problem on the podcast because he'd be barking. Beansy would probably be most disruptive to me personally because she would always be trying to jump on me or get me to play ball with her. Or, she wouldn't leave me alone.
It's tough to host a spirituality podcast when you have 3 dogs that are driving you nuts, right?
Yeah, kind of. The good news is that the dogs, I think, are a big, for me, they're a big part of my spiritual life. I think that the dogs, spirituality and all this stuff can become very much an intellectual exercise. And I think the dogs, more than anything in my life, have taught me how to find my heart and all that.
Oh, really? Can you maybe share any anecdotes, any maybe examples if you can recall one?
I don't know if I can recall a specific example of there's just something about looking at them and seeing the way they are and the love that they give that reaches me in a place that other things don't on a heart level. And it's amazing to me because I went all those years of hating dogs. And now I'm obsessed with them. Every dog I see, I'm just like, wow. It's like I found this new species at, how old am I? At 30 years of age, I found this new species that all of a sudden I just love. And so there's just, I think it's the common things that people say about dogs, that they're so present in the moment. They're, they love you all the time. They're a good model for a lot of the spiritual practices we talk about being present, about loving others. They have that, they're kind of naturally that way. So there's a lot too. I could just observe them and see how they act. But I think more than anything, it's just that the affection I feel for them is, I really feel in my heart. And it's not, I think the great thing about dogs is that it's very uncomplicated. When we start getting into humans and we start talking about love and unconditional love, and I don't mean the romantic sense, I mean more the spiritual sense, the sense of love your neighbor, love the world. When you start getting to people, it gets tricky because people are people, and there's interactions that are going on there, and there's agendas, and there's all kinds of stuff. It's harder. I'm not saying that it's worth aiming at. It's challenging, but with a dog, you can practice very directly because there's just nothing else there. It's a very direct connection, and that dog, besides wanting you to feed it and scratch it, doesn't have much of an agenda. It's just, I think I've been able to feel that unconditional love more with the dog than with people. There's a lot of spiritual practices out there. I'm not a Buddhist, but I draw a lot from the Buddhist tradition, and they have a compassion practice where you start by thinking of somebody that gives you a really warm feeling in your heart, and you sort of focus on that feeling, and then you start extending it out to somebody else, and finally, if you follow it all the way through, you extend it all the way out to people you don't like. There's no better way for me to get in that space initially, to get that sort of warm feeling in my heart, than to think about my dogs. That does it more than thinking about any other people or things. And so for me, that's the spiritual tool, I would say, that the dogs have been.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
If someone were to ask you, why should I adopt a dog or cat or any other animal, what would you say?
I would say that for me, a lot of what I just said, I think that the dogs totally transformed my relationship with a lot of things in the world. It's a real companion, and we live in a lonely society today. It's so different, and a dog is so loving and companionable, and a cat can be. I think it just. The simplest answer to me is it increases the quality of my life greatly. My life has been a lot better with dogs around. I've been a better person. I have felt happier. I have things in my house that I can connect with and have love with. So for me, that's the reason. They've been sources of joy for me.
Where'd you grow up, and what was your journey to Columbus, Ohio?
Well, it wasn't far of a journey to Columbus, Ohio, because I was born there, and I lived there for the first 18 years of my life. Then I left, and I kind of hopped around for a while. I spent some time out in San Francisco. I spent some time in Walnut Creek. I spent a little bit of time in New York City. I was ostensibly being a musician. What I really was being was a drug addict that was kind of avoiding life. So I lived a lot of those places, but by the time I was 22, I was back home, and I have been in Columbus really ever since.
My geographic journey is almost like a mirror image of yours. I grew up in Buffalo, attended Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, moved to New York City, and then out here to really Oakland, not San Francisco, but Oakland. And then, of course, I'm calling you today from Walnut Creek, California. So.
Oh, yep. I used to live there.
Yeah, there you go. We are technologically more connected than ever. Yet I think a lot of people would agree with you that life in general is lonely. Why do you think that is?
That's a great question, but I think I love the internet and technology and the way that it connects. You and I wouldn't be having this call. I would not be able to talk to the amazing people that I've talked to. The internet is amazing in every way, shape, or form. That said, I don't think the internet or TV are a replacement for being around people. And I think if you think about us biologically, right, we are spiritual. We are social creatures. If you look at our wiring, if you look at the way we evolved, we lived in small tribes of people for a long time. And in the last 400 years or something, everything has just gone boom, from being living very rurally to most people living in something resembling a city or a suburb.
That's right.
And those bonds that were there, the family bonds, the community bonds, those have broken. And I think I'm not one of those people that are like, oh, the good old days, because there's lots of amazing things about today that are great that were not great then. It certainly was not probably lovely to be, say, to be a homosexual in a farming village 200 years ago, right? And so this fragmenting, this individualization of culture has really happened. And in my own life, I tend to see things go from one extreme to the other extreme, and then they kind of find their way back to the middle. And I'm hoping that after the extreme of being these very tight-knit groups, very tribal groups, and the things that are really good about that, and the things that are really bad about that, we've swung almost all the way over to the opposite, which is everybody is their own thing. And you have to figure out what you want to be, and you have to be that thing yourself. And there's all that pressure to do it. And it's all about kind of what you wrap around you on the outside. I'm hoping that there's a swing back towards the middle somewhere where we find a more modern way that we can build those connections and get closer with people. The science out there is overwhelming that loneliness is probably worse for you than smoking. health-wise, as far as your longevity and all that. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I've learned from the show is I think most of my life I thought about living a good life and becoming more spiritual and all that as a going inward thing. It was a meditation. It was a contemplation. It was inward focused. And the show has taught me that it's both. That's a key component of it. That solitude, that inward nature, the meditation. But the relationships around us are also a key part of a life that's good. I mean, the subtag for the show is conversations about creating a life worth living. And over, I've been reminded that the relationships we have in our lives are a very important part of that. And so I don't, you could read 30 sociology books about why we've gotten to the state of loneliness that we have. And there's lots of great ones out there. There's a book called Bowling Alone. There's lots of different ones. The question I think that's more interesting is how do we start to fix it? What can people themselves do? How do you move out of isolation into more connection with other people? And I think sometimes we've gotten so used to being isolated that moving out of that isolation into connection with other people doesn't feel great sometimes. I mean, other people are complicated. Connection with other people it brings tension, it brings stress, it brings the possibility of rejection. Being kind of off on your own with your own little thing is safer. But like I said, the science sure seems to show that it's not really good for us.
How do folks find you?
The website's best. It's oneyoufeed.net. It's all spelled out, ONEYOUFEED.net. And then I'm pretty active on Twitter also, which is just at oneyoufeed. Again, all spelled out.
You're a weekly show.
Yep.
Are you and Chris ever going to take a breath? Because as far as I see, I don't think you guys started when? Like, was it 2014? And you really haven't stopped.
We've done 122 straight weeks. Yes. We might. I think Chris is probably more inclined to be like, all right, for crying out loud, would a week off kill us? I don't know. For whatever reason, I just made a commitment to releasing an episode a week. And so maybe the day will come where we don't release a new one. We re-release an old one because there's a whole lot of them at this point we could do. But sure. Right now, the commitment remains once a week, Tuesday evenings, you'll get a new episode.
How do you find guests? I mean, what kind of turns you on when you think about a potential guest?
I'm usually, the two main type of guests I'm drawn to mostly are either musicians whose music I love that also I think either in their life or their lyrics have something that I can work with in the context of living a good life. Or authors. There's tons of authors, whether they be psychologists or spiritual teachers or whatever, but people who've written something that we can dig into a little bit more and learn more about some of these different concepts. Those are the main sorts of things I'm looking for. At this point, I am getting, so many, I just get requests never endingly for people to be on the show. And I say no way, way, way more than I say yes, which I am finally starting to get comfortable with. But boy, it was really hard for me for a long time to say no to people who want to be on and who are doing good work and interesting things. But it really has to be that I am interested.
Yeah.
I am curious. If you're coming on the show, like I said, you've probably got a book or you're a musician, and I'm going to sit down and I'm probably going to read the whole thing. At least I may read a couple of your books. So I have to be interested in what you're doing. It has to pique my curiosity. I have to think that there's something in there to learn, to see something in a different way or have something presented in a different fashion. That's the ultimate line, is my own curiosity.
Right. Nothing worse than having to finish a book that you don't really enjoy. So
that's right.
If there was one sort of spiritual discipline or maybe just some kind of daily habit you would recommend to folks, what would that be?
Well, for me, it's been meditation. But I think maybe stepping back from that, I think it's one of our guests was a guy named Dan Harris, and he's an anchor man for Nightline and Good Morning America on the weekends. And he wrote a book called 10% Happier, which is basically about his experience with meditation. Mm-hmm. And he said that he wanted to call the book "The Voice in My Head is an Asshole."
It's a good line. It's a very good line.
It's an amazingly good line. And so I think if there's any spiritual practice, anything that that can be more life-changing than anything else is to start to recognize that the voice that is always going on in your head is A, not necessarily you, B, is not true all the time, and C, tends to never shut up. That if you can get just the slightest bit of distance from that, if you can just start to sort of see that, life can just make this subtle tilt. And the less you identify with that voice, particularly if you've got a really negative voice, if you've just got a voice in your head that is always judging everything, I don't like this, I don't like that, I wish this, I wish that. If you can get a little bit of distance from that, life gets a lot better. And so meditation is a practice to do that. Mindfulness is a way of doing that. There's different ways to do that. But I think learning to get a little bit of space between ourselves and the voice in our head is the fundamental spiritual practice.
If you had that magic wand and you could fix something about animal rescue, what would it be?
I'm not far enough in the scene to know. But what I would say would be that there be more, I'm going to say money in the field. And I'm only going to say that because that every animal rescue organization I've worked with are wonderful people who are way overwhelmed. And I see that the ability to place animals with people it's hard because people are spread so many different ways. And so the animal rescue organizations I've worked with, if they maybe had a little bit more money so that there was like a full-time person or something, I think they could be more effective. I guess if I could wave my wand, I would just say no animals need to be rescued. If I had that kind of power, that's what I would do. But I think that the ability to get back to potential fosters and owners sometimes seems to be lacking in some of the animal rescue groups that I've been involved with.
Okay.
Like you find people who are eager and yet they're not, it's just hard. It's not happening at a rate, and the people who want to adopt an animal get frustrated sometimes and don't want to do it. And so that would be my thing. But like I said, those people, I think, dedicate their lives to it every spare moment. So there can be no complaining about them.
We're talking to Eric Zimmer, co-host of the One You Feed podcast. Maybe talk a little bit about your cover art, because it of course has an animal theme to it.
It's a picture of two wolves. I guess it's like a wolf face, one looking one direction, one looking the other direction. And, one is a pleasant looking, happy wolf, and the other is a snarling wolf. And it sort of sums up the theme of this battle inside us between the good and bad wolf. And also on our website, I believe under the About page, there's some pictures of our dogs too. Yeah, there's one that's got like 7 or 8 black and white dogs in it. It's like the extended family, but those are all either, Chris and I and one other person's dogs that are all sort of family in a way.
For those folks who are like fans of Japanese anime cinema or anything like that, it almost has that illustration quality, which I think is pretty neat. So.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's got a little of the Tao symbol, right? To the
yes.
So yeah. Oh no, I was thrilled when we got that logo. I had put it out on like 99 designs in different places, and I got a bunch of good ones back. But then a friend of mine who's an artist said, "I'm going to take a run at it," and sent me that, and I was instantly like, "That is it. That is the one." Anything
else that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention?
I think you've got it. I was excited to get a chance to talk about my dogs, because Chris and I are, we love dogs. It's a big part of our life, and it's there in the show, but it's not something that comes up very often. But they're a big part of, what I would consider the good things in my life.
We want to say thank you to Eric Zimmer for sharing his story. If you want to learn more about Eric and his podcast, go to our show notes at thisispawprint.com/82. If you'd like to meet me or Nancy on social media, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, look for us at This Is Paw Print, all one word. If you'd like to listen to more episodes of Paw Print, you can find us on your favorite podcast app like iTunes, SoundCloud, or iHeartRadio. Make sure to hit subscribe to get the latest episodes immediately. If you want to join our community, sign up for our email list, and you'll also receive some great positive reinforcement dog training tips from Irit Bloom. Simply go to thisispawprint.com/ask and sign up. We want to say thank you to all of you for sharing Paw Print with your friends and family. And remember, you spread a positive message of love and peace by saving an animal. Have a great day, everyone. And see you next time on Paw Print.
Paw Print is a production of EVER Education.
You can't handle the truth.